Hey everybody, welcome to Sugar Shack 2024. So I'm here in Hocking County at a property I own where I boil down sap into syrup just about every year. And so that's what we're gonna do for you and show you my setup, which is a variation of the kinds of things that lots of people do, and take you through what that entails today. It's starting to rain on us, but we'll do the best we can. All right, so I'm here with my friend John Steyerman. Right on cue. Okay, John's a colleague and friend of mine from Wright State University, and he's an expert in insect evolutionary biology and ecology. So I'm sure I'll have him back on this series in the future regarding those kinds of topics. But we're here today to boil down all that sap I showed you throughout in earlier segments with this little setup that I'm going to introduce to you. And so we basically have just gotten the fire going in this contraption, but what this thing is this is just simply a steel drum that was present on this property when I acquired it. And so I cleaned it out. I'm not totally sure what was in that, but I cleaned it out well and then did a couple things to it, as you can see. First of all, I cut two holes with a jigsaw on the top that hold steam table pans, okay, which are right here. There's kind of caramelized sugar in there right now, but those are gonna fit in those two slots in the top. I cut a door in the one end so you can regulate the airflow into that. Usually it's never completely closed, but it can be partially closed to control oxygen levels and the temperature of the fire, which you have to kind of constantly regulate when you do this. Okay, and then in the back end, there's simply I cut a hole in the back and inserted a stovepipe, okay, to carry as much smoke as possible up and away from the syrup as you make it. That's one of the downsides of backyard maple sugar operations is the syrup can get very smoky if you don't try to control the smoke a little bit. Now you can see that there is smoke that escapes through these holes in the top, but when the trays are in there, it's not too bad. So the majority of the smoke is going to be going out the back end, and that helps a lot. You know, the first time I did this, I did it on an open fire in my backyard, and I ended up with pretty smoky, ashy syrup in the end. Okay, now inside this barrel, I basically just have a little bit of brick lining the base of it to serve like fire brick to insulate the barrel somewhat. So more of the heat comes upward rather than downward. All right, now we're going to be feeding in, and we just got this fire started a little bit ago. We're going to be feeding in wood, of course, and what John is splitting over there is some sassafras, which is a tree that grows here in this part of the state pretty abundantly. And this was a tree that fell across a trail in my property that I had to deal with. And so it's going to help us produce maple syrup today. Okay, and then this is always the fun part too. These little logs in front of you here are red maple logs from a tree that fell as well. And so these maple logs are going to help us make maple syrup today. Now you notice that I have these things stacked right next to the barrel. And that's to heat them up and dry them as we're doing this process. You wouldn't leave that there unattended because those things can heat up and catch on fire. But as long as you're watching things, that just helps dry them out. So when you're ready to throw them in the barrel, they're nice and dry and ready to go. Okay, so let me just show you how the pans work then. So these are just steam table trays, stainless steel. And again, that's some caramelized sugar in there that you just simply, it's almost impossible to remove. But that's basically it. Okay, so there are two trays. This is the cooler end of the setup. And so this is sort of the starter tray. And as that boils down, it gets moved to the finishing tray. And all of today's sap will end up at the end of the day in this tray. Okay, at that point, we'll collect it and just take it in a pot and finish it inside. All right, so that's basically the setup. Want to get started here. And again, it's also mounted just sitting up on concrete blocks. So this is my setup, and there's all kinds of variations on this, but this has worked very well for us in the past. And then so a traditional sugar shack would have some type of evaporator, whatever it's going to be like, but there often would be a roof on top of it. It's often a highly ventilated shack because you're creating a lot of smoke and stuff. But so this is an open sugar shack, but it's fun nonetheless. And we just hang out. This will take several hours. I have about 21 or 22 gallons of sap here to boil down in these containers. And so we'll just feed that into these trays little by little throughout the day until we get our finished product. So I will get back to you as the process moves along. All right, let me take you through the process of after we've gotten the sap to start to boil, what you do all day long, essentially. Okay, so here we've got a good boil going on in these steam table trays. And in this little setup, the rear tray is hotter than the front tray just because of the way the air flows and the heat flows through this system. So this one evaporates quicker than this one. And so we end up having that to be the collection pan for the whole boil. But they obviously lose volume as you go. So you have to constantly be moving some of this sap into this tray and then adding fresh sap into this tray. So I basically just use a ladle. And as this volume declines in this tray, I just steadily move some over. Okay, no tricks to it. And do that sort of thing, right? And then next we're gonna add more fresh sap to this tray up to the top. Now you'll notice that, you know, obviously with a fire, the heat will vary throughout the day. So we're constantly gonna be feeding this fire, maybe opening and closing this door to regulate airflow. But the whole point is, you know, you want it to be a continuous, steady boil, but not to be overflowing your pans. So that's really the only thing you have to be aware of. And now this sap is already starting to go through the browning process as well that I talked about in earlier segments, the caramelization process and the Maillard reaction that's happening in this syrup. And so that's what we'll be doing for the next several hours. Earlier in this episode, I introduced you to sugar maples and black walnuts, of course, the trees that we actually tapped. Most of the sap we have over here today is sugar maple sap. But I want to introduce red maples to you as well, because this is a species that you can also tap for maple syrup. It's a little bit on the lower of a lower sugar content than the sugar maple sap, but it's still very usable. Very abundant tree in southeastern Ohio and in the eastern US. Very widely distributed tree. And John, if you wouldn't mind grabbing a leaf of red maple, we'll take a look at that. There we go. Okay, there's a standard red maple leaf. And again, most people recognize that shape of a leaf as a maple leaf, but how do you know it's a red maple? Well, red maples tend to have three major lobes to their leaves. Okay, they have, you know, points at the end with some serration in between, but in contrast to a sugar maple leaf or a black maple or a Norway maple, those species would have much more prominent lobes at the bottom as well. So they're more five-pointed or five-lobed, where red maple tends to be three-lobed. Now, this species is called red maple because there's always something red on it almost all parts of the year. I'm going to pause for a second to see if we can catch this thing on camera. Okay, now, what that was a helicopter that's equipped with dangling saws that are used to in the trimming of power line right-of-ways. Okay, so they literally fly that helicopter up and down power line right-of-ways through forested areas and trim the bordering tree vegetation along each side of right-of-way. And so it's a pretty wild thing to watch happen. There's a column there of like, what do you think, John? How many saws were there? Six or eight saws dangling. And, they have to fly this across this hilly terrain and, up and down, move the helicopter up and down. It's a pretty crazy scene. And then occasionally you have to fly back to their base to get gas, get fuel. So that's where that one just apparently went to. Again, red maple is called red maple because there's always something red on the tree almost all times of the year. So over the winter, when there are no leaves, no flowers, no anything, the ends of the twigs of a red maple have a reddish cast in them, which we can't see from here, but trust me, that would be true. This time of year, and I can see as I pan up this tree that it's starting to bud out. So this tree is almost reaching the untappable stage, by the way, which I talked about last time. That about signals the end of the tapping season when the trees bud out. But those buds would be very red. That's another thing, okay? As the tree grows throughout the summer, the petioles on the leaves are red while the leaves are fairly green. And then, of course, red maple in the fall turns brilliant red. Its fall colors are brilliant reds. So red maple has something red on it just about all season long. There are other things that you can use to identify it. John, you had a question about that.
Well, I was wondering, this trunk looks a lot like a sugar maple, and is there a way you can distinguish just from the bark characteristics between those two species?
Yeah, that's a good question. In an earlier segment, I talked about how sugar maple tends to have these bark protrusions or flakes that are tough and rigid. Okay, now when you come upon a red maple, you can see it also does, but they are weaker, and it's subtle. So this one doesn't look that unlike a sugar maple, but these bark extensions are weaker. They're easier to break. Okay, so that is one of the characteristics. They're a light gray bark. They have a more shredded appearance. Here's another red maple as well. It has more of a shredded appearance. And again, these bark flakes are not very tough. Okay, on a sugar maple, those things are really tough to break like that. So I think that's one of the keys to the differences between sugar maple and red maple, even though they do, generally look very similar on first glance. The young trees have a very pale, smooth bark as well. I don't have any young red maples in my view right now, but they're very characteristic as well. Very pale, almost whitish, smooth bark. Here's something we talked about in Wright States woods. What do you think, John?
I think that's a yellow-bellied sapsucker.
All right. Well, I'm glad for the confirmation because that's what I said when we saw that at Wright States woods. And again, that's a bird that's doing the same thing we're doing right now. Okay, it taps these, pokes these holes into the sapwood of trees. This one was done probably last year or maybe even the year before to get the sap to run out, and then the birds, which are a form of woodpecker, feed on that sap. And then there's some idea that that insects and things that might be attracted to that sap, that they would feed on those insects as well. But I think that's less important to them than the sap itself. Now, this happens to be on a shagbark hickory, a relatively young one. But you can see these thin, shaggy shags.
There's the bigger one over there.
Yep. We happen to have a lot of shagbark hickories here on this property. And interestingly, while we're on this topic of syrup making, did you know you can make syrup out of hickory as well?
I did not know that, but you told me you made sap or syrup out of walnuts, which they're related, right? That's
right. They are indeed. So we've been talking about making maple syrup, well, obviously out of maples, but black walnuts as well, black walnut syrup. But you can also make a syrup, a form of syrup out of this tree, which is a tree that I have introduced to people in this series in the past. But just to reintroduce it, this is one of those trees that's very, very well named because it's obvious, its name comes from exactly what it looks like. This is a shagbark hickory. And as you can see, this is a pretty shaggy one. And it has these long bark plates that flake off. And these are really interesting trees. They're slow growing, they're long lived, and they're very important for wildlife. They make a nut that you can eat. You can actually eat the nuts of shagbark hickory. They're not so different than pecans. They're actually they're pretty closely related to pecans. That's something I have not tried, but in this series I might do at some point. So they make a nut that a lot of animals eat, but also they provide habitat for species like bats. So there are lots of species of bats that roost during the day, not in hollows or in caves and things like that, but will actually roost in trees or on trees like this. And what they'll do is they'll basically crawl up underneath these bark plates and hide under there. Okay, so there's a perfect little, it's like their own little roof lean-to right there. Okay, so they'll actually hide underneath these plates and roost. So this is an important roost tree for things like the endangered Indiana bat, for example. Now, the reason I brought it up here today, however, is that you can actually make syrup from hickory, but it's more of a hickory flavored syrup. And I have not tried this yet, but this is more like making a sugar solution that you flavor with the bark of shagbark hickory. So you would take these bark plates or any other bark you can acquire from the tree. You'd want to clean it up a little bit, sterilize it, and then you boil the syrup with the bark, all right, to flavor the syrup. And if you know, the taste of that black walnut syrup is telling, it should be pretty good. Black walnuts and hickories are pretty closely related. And so I have not tried that yet, but that's another thing I might try in this series at some point. All right, now, as I say all this, I'm noticing on this tree that there's something you would not want to add to your hickory syrup, and that's this vine right here. And there's a larger version of it over here. That's a poison ivy vine. Okay, and so poison ivy, this is as a root, obviously, if you can see, it penetrates the ground right there, and all these things, these extensions from it are aerial roots that it uses to grab onto the tree. It does not penetrate the tree. It's not a parasite on this tree in terms of taking nutrition from it, but it can become burdensome for a tree in some cases if it gets up into the canopy and competes with the leaves of the tree for sunlight and so forth, but that's pretty rare, especially for poison ivy. This is a native plant. It's a problematic plant, but wildlife does use poison ivy, the fruits in particular. Okay, they make a white fruit that a lot of birds will feed on in the fall and winter. Okay, so that's poison ivy, but here's the moniker, right? So if you see that sort of thing like that, you might have heard of this moniker about poison ivy, leaves of 3, let it be. So the moniker that goes along with that root is don't be a dope, don't touch the hairy rope, because that also contains the compounds that poison ivy leaves have that will give you the rash. All right, so don't be a dope, don't touch the hairy rope. All right, now what John's doing is we made a transfer of the partially boiled sap from one tray to the other, and he's just adding there some fresh sap. And we're almost through our first container. These trays hold over 2 gallons, 2 to 2.5 gallons. So they hold a much larger volume than they might appear. But you do have to watch when you do that, because John got a snoot full of smoke and he's just about choking over here. So, okay, well, we'll be back as that progresses. All right, so we have things really cooking now. And I just want to show quickly about how efficient this process becomes once the system really heats up, when your wood's good and dry, when the barrel's all dried out. I had a lot of wet ashes in here and bricks that had to warm up and dry out. But right now, everything's burning really well. We got a good boil, and if you take a look at the stovepipe in the back, you can see there's very little smoke coming out of that. There's a lot of heat rising. You can see the air rising with heat, but very little smoke at this point. What you're seeing over these trays is the water vapor boiling off of these trays. And so right now, this is where you want to keep things. The sap is not boiling over, but it's boiling steadily. A nice, hot, efficient fire. And we'll just keep doing this until we work our way through. So we have about one of our containers in the trays and moving along. And we'll move on to the second one here in a second. Okay, so we're doing a transfer, adding more sap to our starting tray. And things are just chugging along at this point. We're probably about halfway through our sap buckets. We still have a few hours to go for sure, but we're getting some good browning happening in our finishing tray. And so I just wanted to show that while we're probably about halfway through. And again, everything's going to end up in the tray I'm showing it right now until we take it inside to do finishing boil inside. All right, well, we're still at it, and it's starting to get dark, so I think this will be our last outdoor segment till we go inside to do the finish boil. But we're going to do just transfer here. And at this point, you can really see the contrast between the starting tray and the finishing tray in terms of the color development. Very good caramelization and browning happening in our finish pan. Starting to look good. We'll taste it here soon as well. But I'll just do, I guess, our last transfer, add in some new sap, and keep going. All right, so John and I are signing off for now.
Later.
And we'll catch you inside for the finished boil. Take care. Here I am back in the kitchen. So 22 gallons of sap have now been evaporated down and boiled down to fit in this pot right here, which is approximately it's about a gallon, maybe a gallon and a quart or so in there. I'm going to boil that down probably another by half again. Haven't turned the burner on yet. And then that'll basically reach our final consistency. It's plenty sweet as it is right now, but it needs to be thickened a little bit more. All right, and when that finishes, I'll sample some on camera. And with these little things, these are called poffertjes, which is a Dutch treat. Okay, it was in Amsterdam back in the fall, and this is a little treat you can basically purchase from street vendors and things like that. They're basically like mini pancakes that you cook in this special little cast iron pan over the burner. And so typically they would be served with butter and powdered sugar like you see here, but I'll use them to test our maple syrup. Okay, and so I'll be back with you shortly. I'm going to get this burner started. I've reached the end of my boil. So that's the entire contents again of about 22 gallons. At this stage, you can test this sugar concentration with something called a hygrometer. I don't usually use that. I just do it by taste and knowing the volume of liquid that I've boiled. And it's pretty darn good. So I've tested it already, but I'll do it on camera for you. Before I do that, I'm going to filter this syrup, through a filter system basically like this. This is just an acrylic filter. It's made out of a material called Orlon. And that's just basically to catch the debris that you see at the bottom of that pot, which, well, you will eventually be able to see at the bottom of that pot, which includes stuff called maple sugar or niter. And this is basically crystallized minerals that are in the sap along with some sugar and condensed and polymerized. And it forms kind of a fine granular material. And it's best to filter that out. You don't really have to, but it's best to filter that out to to kind of purify your syrup. You also want to run the syrup through this filter when it's hot. That'll just facilitate it moving through the filter. And so I don't have the proper setup exactly, but I just have it. I'm going to have it sitting in a colander and catch it all in this pot then that I will pour from to fill some bottles. Okay, so I won't show that step on camera. Literally, I'm going to pour it through there with some assistance, and then get the syrup in some bottles and join you in a second. All right, here's what the filter looks like after I've filtered that syrup through it. And again, there's going to be sugar sand or niter in there. There's going to be some pectin in there as well. Sugar maple sap doesn't have as much pectin in it as the black walnut sap did, but some of that stuff you see in there coating this filter is pectin as well. Okay, so basically I have it filtered, and I currently have it now in this pot. I'm going to transfer it to this little bowl because it has a little spout, and then use that to pour into these nice little bottles, which are nice to bottle up maple syrup in. All right. And so after I do that, I'll be back with you to do our final taste test. Well, here I am at the end of the road, and I'm going to do a little taste test of our maple syrup. All right. It's a long process. It was a long day to boil this down. It took about, with the setup that I have, it took us in all told about 9 hours to boil down that sap, okay, with the setup that I showed you. It's fun though, but it's just a long process, long day, but it's nice late winter, early spring activity to get you outside. Just a little bit ahead of when the spring wildflowers and things are coming out. So it just kind of gives you hope for what's coming next. All right, so here I transferred the boiled down syrup that I showed you into these nice fancy bottles. Okay, and I'll end up getting these are pint-sized bottles essentially, and I'll be getting about 4 of those out of that entire boil. All right, so you can imagine how much sap has to be boiled in a commercial operation to make and sell this stuff. But because of the work goes into it, you can see why, pure high quality maple syrup is not cheap, but it's good stuff. And there's a lot of work that goes into it. Okay, I want to show you another thing too about the colors of the maple syrup and how it depends on what kind of bottle they're in, right? So first of all, there's this one. It has a kind of a light amber, reddish brown coloration to it. But again, this is in a thin bottle, right? So it's, has a different light absorbance and reflectance quality than say this bottle, which is cylindrical. And so when you look through it, you're looking through more syrup and it looks darker. All right. And so you have to be careful that when you choose maple syrup based on the color, there's light, dark, grade A, grade B, so forth. Some of that has to do with the container, the package it's in. Okay, so you can't always trust this is the exact same maple syrup. It looks a little different depending on the container it is in. Okay, now here's my little tasting glass. So I'll taste it alone first and see how that goes. It's still warm and it's great. It's given me all the positive feedback I want from maple syrup. Nice maple flavor. You can just taste the care and nature that goes into that product. So it's great. The next thing I'll do is I'll put a little bit of it on these poffertjes. This Dutch treat, which just a little bit more about that on the side is that this is a kind of a little pancake treat that's often served with powdered sugar, things like that when you get it in, say, Amsterdam. But you can serve it with syrup as well. And so I'll pour a little bit of syrup on these poffertjes and taste them in that way. Okay, and this treat originated, by the way, these small tiny pancakes originated as a way to jazz up communion wafers, more or less, that Catholics used in the act of communion. All right, so that's the origin of this treat. But then, of course, it became elaborated and so forth to serve around the holidays. Typically, it's kind of like a seasonal Christmas time sort of treat. So here we go. Very, very good, very appropriate for them. It'd be great on your typical blueberry pancakes just as well. But another Sugar Shack in the books. Sugar Shack 2024 will conclude right now. And see you next year. Okay, bye-bye.